It happened in a moment so quiet that even the royal guard shifted their stance, unsure if they had just witnessed history or heartbreak. As King Charles turned away, walking down the long stone path of Windsor, Camilla didn't call out to him. She didn't need to. Her eyes said everything: fear, devotion, and a kind of sorrow only understood by two people who carried a kingdom's weight. What had passed between them? And why did the royal guards suddenly tighten their formation, as if bracing for something unspoken? Before we unravel this emotional moment inside the royal circle, feel free to tap like if you enjoy deep, human stories behind the crown. Subscribe if you want more calm, thoughtful breakdowns of the royal family's most surprising moments. And hey, share this with someone who loves a good royal mystery. Now, let's step into a story that stayed off the official cameras, but not off the record. The courtyard at Windsor was unusually still that morning, not quiet, but still. There's a difference. Quiet is soft, stillness, though. Stillness feels like the world is holding its breath. And that was exactly the feeling as King Charles stepped forward, his shoes tapping against the stone with a rhythm far too measured, far too controlled for what was happening behind his eyes. No royal announcement had been made. No statements were issued. But if you watched closely, not at Charles, but at the people beside him, you could sense it. Something had shifted, something delicate, something private. Camilla stood just 3 steps behind him, her hands folded in front of her, though they tightened ever so slightly every time his shoulders rose and fell. Not a word passed between them, none needed to. Their eyes carried the entire conversation. And the royal guards? Even they felt it. Their stance, usually firm and almost statuesque, seemed a hair more grounded than usual, as if the emotional weight between the king and queen had somehow passed through the air and settled into their boots. But let's step back a moment, not in time, but in focus, because this wasn't simply a walk. This wasn't a ceremonial stroll or a rehearsed exit. This was something far more private, far more raw. Charles had just finished a briefing, one of those sensitive, delicate ones he never enjoyed, but always carried with a sense of duty. He took it quietly, shoulders slightly lowered, eyes blinking slower than usual. When he stepped outside, he wasn't walking toward anything. He was walking away, away from the conversation, away from responsibilities for a moment, away from a truth he wasn't ready to voice. Camilla noticed immediately. You know how some people read rooms and others read souls? Camilla had learned to read Charles long before the world accepted her place beside him. She noticed the little things, the way his jaw was set just a bit tighter, the way he exhaled through his nose rather than his mouth. Small signals, human signals. So when he walked forward without looking back, she understood instantly. He needed a moment, a breath, a space where the crown couldn't reach him. The guards, of course, didn't understand the emotional details, but they understood posture. They understood energy. And the king's energy was off. That's why 2 of them subtly adjusted their spacing, closing a gap by an inch or 2, a tiny move, nearly invisible to the casual eye, but it was instinct. A protective reflex. What was he walking away from? That's a question the public didn't ask because they didn't know there was a question to begin with. Cameras capture surfaces, not shadows. But this moment lived in the shadows, the pause between duty and humanity. Charles paused at the edge of the courtyard, hands clasped behind him the way his father used to stand when deep in thought, a habit inherited not by blood but by example. He looked toward the horizon, the same horizon he'd seen 1,000 times, but this time, he didn't really see it. His gaze wasn't about the view. It was about escape, the small, quiet kind that only lasts for a breath. Behind him, Camilla's eyes glistened, not dramatically. Not like a film scene. It was the glimmer of someone who knew that the person she loved was hurting, and couldn't help him, at least not yet. Emotional restraint isn't coldness. Sometimes it's respect. And that was the part that struck the royal guards the most. They saw everything always. They weren't just walls in uniform. They were observers, protectors, witnesses to moments the world never hears about. They noticed Charles' shoulders slump half an inch. They noticed Camilla inhale sharply but hold the breath so it wouldn't escape as a sigh. They noticed that the space between the king and queen felt wider than it should have been, and yet tethered by something powerful. Every royal family has private storms, but this one didn't roar. It whispered. Camilla took one step forward and then another. Each step was a question. Should I go to him? Should I wait? Does he need silence or support? Those are not the questions of a queen. Those are the questions of a partner, a human one. But she didn't call out his name. She didn't say, "Charles, wait." She didn't reach out. Why?
Because she knew that if she intervened too soon, she might break the fragile clarity he was reaching for. She knew he needed space. She also knew he needed her. The impossible tension between giving distance and providing comfort. It played across her face in a way words could never describe. Her eyes glimmered again, and this time the guard saw not just the shine, but the emotion behind it. One of them, the one on her left, felt his throat tighten slightly, the same way it does when you send someone about to cry but trying not to. They weren't supposed to react emotionally, but humans are humans under any uniform. Charles finally turned his head, just slightly, a sideways glance, almost accidental, but not quite. He didn't look directly at Camilla, but he looked toward her, and that alone said enough. He still felt her presence, her support, her patience. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence stretched in between them, delicate but unbroken. What was he thinking? Was it about his health? His responsibilities? The pressure of public expectation? Something personal? Something painful? Only he knows. But what the guards understood in that moment was this. This wasn't the silence of anger. It wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of someone carrying a burden too heavy for words. And Camilla, for all the criticism she has faced in her life, stood there with a softness that felt almost protective. Her eyes weren't just wet. They were speaking. "I'm here, even if you can't reach back right now. I'm here." Charles straightened his shoulders, just slightly. It was the kind of movement a person makes when they decide to keep going even when they're tired. He glanced forward again, took one more step, and then paused. And that pause was everything. It was the unspoken goodbye. Not to Camilla, but to the moment of vulnerability he was leaving behind. Camilla understood. The guards understood. No words were exchanged. But sometimes the deepest messages are carried in silence. If there is one group in a royal household trained to appear invisible while seeing everything, it's the Royal Guard. Their uniforms may be pristine, their movements sharp, but behind that stoic exterior are eyes that catch the smallest flicker of emotion, especially on days when the palace feels heavier than usual. And on that morning, the air carried a weight every guard felt the moment King Charles stepped outside. They didn't exchange obvious glances. They didn't shift dramatically. But you could sense the silent communication passing between them. A subtle tightening of posture, a fractional turn of the head, a shared awareness that something wasn't right. Royal guards are trained to read physical cues. Gait, breathing patterns, stance changes. But what set this moment apart was how deeply emotional the cues were. They weren't watching for threats. They were watching for signs of a man under pressure. One guard, a veteran who had served for more than a decade, noticed it first. Charles's stride was steady, but it lacked its usual purpose. There was no hint of ceremony in it, no expectation of cameras, no polished posture meant for the public. This was a walk taken by a man trying to collect himself without letting anyone hear the pieces shifting. The guard didn't speak, couldn't speak, but he understood the weight of that walk. He'd seen it before, not that exact walk, but the pattern. Moments when members of the royal family carried burdens that didn't make headlines, but echoed quietly through the halls. Behind Charles, Camilla's presence radiated something equally powerful. Not fragility. She's far too seasoned, too steady for that. But quiet ache, like someone holding a fragile glass in their hands and trying not to let it slip. The guards noticed her shoulders lift slightly, then drop in controlled exhale. They noticed her fingers brush one another, a gesture she often made when unsure whether to step forward or stand still. It wasn't nervousness. It was empathy trying to decide how loudly it should speak. But perhaps the most telling thing was the silence among the guards themselves. These men and women work in pairs, rows, and rotations. They are accustomed to constant awareness. But in that moment, a strange unity settled between them, a collective understanding without a single word shared. One guard, positioned near the queen, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. The move wasn't tactical. It was emotional, a sign that he, too, felt the tension between king and queen. Not a conflict, but a fragile moment. He wasn't alone. Another guard, stationed by the archway, kept his eyes forward but tuned his ears to the subtle sound behind him. The queen's breath, the king's hesitant pause, the quiet scrape of shoes on stone. When Charles stopped at the edge of the courtyard, the guards felt the moment tighten like the air before a storm. And when Camilla took a small, careful step forward, every guard tracked it, not out of protocol, but because the emotional weight in her movement was unmistakable. She stopped, but her eyes didn't, and the guard saw it all. The way her gaze softened, the way her lips pressed together in a tight line as if holding back something she couldn't say. Camilla rarely lets emotion slip in public, especially in front of staff, but that morning felt less like a staged moment and more like an involuntary reveal. One younger guard, new to the post and still adjusting to the demands of working around the monarchy, admitted later in confidence to a colleague that he felt something twist in his chest when he saw the queen's eyes glimmer. "I didn't expect to feel it," he said, "but it hit me. They're human first, royal second. Human first." That was the theme of the morning. Another subtle moment unfolded, one that won't make any documentary, one that the public will never hear about but the guards will remember. Charles lifted his head toward the horizon, but his shoulders trembled, just once, barely visible. But to a trained observer, it was unmistakable, a sign of emotional strain. That single tremor changed the guard's posture instantly. One pair tightened their formation by an inch. Someone else inhaled quietly, preparing for anything, not because they expected danger, but because vulnerability in a monarch calls for heightened awareness. Yet what happened next surprised even the guards. Charles didn't falter. He didn't wipe his face. He didn't look for support. He took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're searching for courage, and let his shoulders drop into a more relaxed, resigned position. It wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a sign of acceptance, a private moment of grounding, and the guards respected it, not by looking away, but by standing firmer, as if their silent presence was a wall he needed in that moment. One guard later described it perfectly. "It felt like our job wasn't to protect the king from threats. It was to protect his moment of peace." Camilla saw it too, the breath, the grounding. Her expression softened, not in pity, but in recognition. She had seen that breath many times, over decades through storms, scandals, and the long road to the throne. The guards observed her hesitation, the tiny forward lean of her body, the moment she almost stepped to the side. But she held herself back, not because of protocol, because she respected the emotional space he needed. The young guard near her felt a lump form in his throat again. "It's rare to see that kind of understanding between two people," he whispered to his senior later. Then came the shift, the moment everything in the courtyard seemed to exhale. Charles turned his head slightly, barely enough to see Camilla, yet enough to acknowledge her, and that single gesture carried more tenderness than an entire speech. The guards caught it instantly. A few straightened their posture, almost unconsciously, as if witnessing a moment they weren't meant to intrude upon. Camilla's eyes softened further. She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. But the message in her eyes was unmistakable. "Take your time. I'll be here when you're ready." And the guards, who rarely deal in emotion, felt something collective, a stirring of respect, not for crown, but for the people beneath it. When Charles finally took another step forward, the guards responded almost by instinct, falling into tighter formation, not because he needed protection, but because he needed steadiness around him. And when he paused, that crucial pause between vulnerability and movement, the guards held their breath too, sensing the moment's significance. It was an unspoken goodbye, not to Camilla, but to the weight he'd momentarily set down. The guards didn't whisper. They didn't look at each other, but every single one of them knew they had just witnessed something rare, something human, something the public would never see, but they would never forget. Long before the cameras softened their tone, long before headlines shifted from scorn to sympathy, Charles and Camilla lived a life forged in shadows. Not dark shadows, but the kind cast by misunderstood loyalty, unspoken devotion, and years of holding each other up when the world offered very little space for them to simply be. Their story wasn't written in fairy tale ink. It was written in ink smudged by time, pressure, and public judgment. And perhaps that's why, on mornings like the one in the courtyard, their quiet glances carried so much meaning. Because underneath the crowns, responsibilities, scandals, and ceremonies, their bond had been tested in ways few marriages ever endure. To understand the gravity of that silent moment, you have to understand the history behind it. Long before Camilla ever stood beside Charles as queen, she was the person who steadied him. The person who spoke to him in low, grounding tones, who knew how to calm the storms he often hid from the world. Their connection, for decades, navigated everything from duty to heartbreak, from intense public scrutiny to the longing to finally exist openly. There's a question people often ask. Why does their bond feel so solid now? The answer is simple. Because it wasn't built quickly. It was built slowly, quietly, piece by piece, through years of whispered reassurance and moments that were not photographed, not published, not preserved anywhere except in the memories of two people who refused to let go of each other. And the palace staff, including the guards, have witnessed these quiet threads of loyalty for years. There was a time, many years back, when Charles returned from an exhausting diplomatic tour. He was drained physically and emotionally. A long hallway separated him from Camilla, but the moment he saw her waiting at the end of it, his posture changed. He didn't quicken his steps. He simply softened. One guard remembered it vividly. She didn't say a word. She just reached out, and he looked like he'd finally come home. Their relationship wasn't built on dramatic gestures. It was built on the small ones, the kind that cement themselves deeper than any public display ever could. Camilla also understood Charles's moments of heaviness. She'd seen him at his most composed and at his most overwhelmed. She'd been there when duty demanded emotional sacrifice. She'd been there in the quiet aftermath of loss, particularly after the passing of Queen Elizabeth. A loss that hit Charles not just as a monarch stepping into a new role, but as a son losing a mother. During a private moment after the Queen's funeral, Charles became visibly emotional. Not in a public-facing way, not in the king under pressure narrative the world expected, but in a deeply human way. One guard, stationed discreetly nearby, noticed Camilla's hand slip into his without fanfare. No words, no dramatic sighs, just presence. That's what their marriage is built on, presence in the small moments. And presence is exactly what defined the emotional tension in the courtyard that morning. When Charles walked away, he wasn't walking away from Camilla. He was walking away from the pressure pressing down on him. Camilla knew this intimately. Over the years, she had learned to distinguish between Charles stepping away from her and Charles stepping away from the weight of the crown. Their marriage, in a sense, is a constant balancing act, one foot in duty, the other in personal history. Some marriages are strengthened by ease. Theirs was strengthened by survival. Camilla, too, carries her own emotional weight. For years, she navigated a narrative that didn't allow her to be human. She was reduced to caricature, judged endlessly, misunderstood by millions who never met her, never heard her tone, never saw how gently she spoke to people behind the scenes. But Charles knew, he always knew, that understanding created a bond thicker than public opinion. A bond built in the shadows before it ever reached the light. There's a moment rarely spoken about outside the palace walls. Years before their marriage, Charles faced intense stress over a decision that, publicly, seemed straightforward but privately was tearing at him. Camilla didn't push. She didn't lecture. She simply told him, quietly, "Whatever you choose, choose from your heart. I will stand beside you either way." That single sentence stayed with him for years. And it was no surprise, then, that when he eventually needed true steadiness, he turned toward her, not away. So when Camilla's eyes glistened in the courtyard, it wasn't fear of separation or insecurity in the marriage. It was the ache of watching someone she loves carry a burden she couldn't lift for him. And Charles felt it. Even as he stood facing the horizon, he felt her presence behind him like a soft wind at his back. He felt the quiet endurance of their history holding him up. He felt the truth of their connection, built not on perfect moments, but on imperfect ones survived together. The royal guard sensed it too, the emotional undertone rooted in years of resilience. They had seen the subtle gestures between Charles and Camilla countless times. The quick touch of his hand on her back when she seemed overwhelmed. The way she leaned slightly toward him during tense ceremonies. The shared glance that said, "We're in this together." Their story wasn't born from ease. It was born from challenge. And challenge has a way of creating marriages that do not crumble under pressure, they deepen. On that morning, as Charles paused and Camilla silently waited, you could almost feel their entire history between them. Decades of whispers, compromises, shared glances, quiet comfort, and moments too tender for the public stage. It made the silence powerful. It made the distance feel intentional, not cold. It made the tears in Camilla's eyes speak with the voice of someone who has walked through storms and still stands fiercely by the man she loves. Their marriage isn't perfect. No marriage is. But it is layered, tested, loyal. And that loyalty was the invisible thread tying them together that morning, stretching between their steps, their glances, their silences. A marriage built in shadows, strengthened in storms, and revealed quietly, softly, in a single unspoken moment. The moment King Charles stepped forward again, that small, decisive step, something shifted across the courtyard. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it carried the weight of a man choosing to keep moving despite the heaviness pulling at him. And this time, the air felt different. The royal guards reacted first. Their formation tightened almost imperceptibly, as if instinctively bracing for whatever emotional storm the king was walking back into. Their boots grounded themselves more firmly on the stone. Their eyes sharpened, not with suspicion, but with awareness. They weren't just guarding a king. They were guarding a moment. Camilla stood behind him, still as a portrait, but her eyes followed every move. When Charles paused, that crucial, delicate pause, the entire courtyard seemed to freeze. Even the breeze hesitated. The sun hit the stone in a warm glow, but the tension lingering between king and queen felt like a thread pulled taut. And then it happened. Charles didn't turn fully. He didn't return to her, but he gave a small, almost invisible nod, a gesture so subtle most people would have missed it. But Camilla didn't. The guards didn't. That nod was his way of saying what he couldn't bring himself to speak aloud. "I'm all right. I'm still here. I just need a moment longer." Camilla's lips trembled for the briefest second. It wasn't sadness. It was relief. A quiet, heavy relief. Her eyes softened as the tears she fought back settled instead of falling. She breathed out, long and controlled, the kind of exhale you let out when you've been silently holding yourself together. That silent exchange, that nod, echoed louder than any conversation could, because sometimes the most powerful communication is the kind made without sound. Inside the palace, staff noticed immediately when the king and queen eventually returned, not because of anything dramatic, but because of their posture. Charles walked in steadier than when he had left. Camilla walked slightly closer to him than before, her presence less hesitant, more sure. One senior footman later said, it was like they'd had a conversation without ever speaking. The air between them felt understood. And that was the part no headline captured. We often imagine the royal family as symbols, stoic, flawless, distant. But behind closed doors, the palace walls hold hundreds of stories exactly like this one. Human, raw, gentle, unspoken. A quiet goodbye had passed between them that morning. Not a goodbye to each other, but a goodbye to a moment of fragility. Charles had stepped away to gather himself. Camilla had stayed back to hold steady for him. And when he finally looked back, even slightly, he signaled that he was ready to return. That's the kind of goodbye you don't rehearse. You don't plan. You don't announce. It just happens. In the stillness, where emotions breathe freely and crowns can't weigh down the heart. Later in the day, the guards who witnessed the moment shared silent glances with one another. They wouldn't speak of it, not officially, not to anyone outside their circle. But they all knew they had seen something rare. One guard, the younger one, replayed the moment in his mind for hours. In training, he'd been taught how to handle threats, how to stand in formation, how to protect the crown. But no one had trained him for witnessing the quiet tenderness between a king and queen trying to navigate the pressures of life. He said nothing, but he felt changed. Witnessing humanity softens even the most disciplined minds. Inside Windsor, the king's aides approached him more gently than usual. They sensed his fatigue. They sensed the emotional residue of the morning. But Charles handled the rest of his engagements with a softened, steadier demeanor, as if the moment of pause had given him a breath he desperately needed. Camilla remained close by through the day, offering small glances that had become their private language. She didn't hover. She didn't overstep. But every time he looked her way, she was already watching, not with worry, but with the steady loyalty that had carried them through decades. That night, long after the palace halls quieted and the guards rotated into their midnight positions, a staff member walking past the private quarters saw a light still on. Two silhouettes sat inside, close, quiet, facing one another, not speaking, not arguing, just sharing the same space. Sometimes love doesn't need dialogue. Sometimes presence is enough. And that presence echoed through the palace more loudly than their morning silence. The unspoken goodbye earlier, the one that hung between them in the courtyard, had transformed into something else by nightfall, a gentle reaffirmation that despite the pressures of crown, the long days, the whispers of the public, and the private burdens, they remained a united front. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't romantic in a grand, sweeping way. It was simply human. And in a world that demands perfection from the royal family, humanity is the rarest thing of all. By morning, the palace was back to its usual rhythm. Guards stood at attention. Staff bustled with quiet efficiency. Official duties resumed. Cameras returned to their positions. And the world saw a king and queen walking together again, composed, steady, dignified. But those who had witnessed the moment in the courtyard would always remember it differently. They had seen a king weighed down by pressures no one else fully understood. They had seen a queen whose love spoke louder in silence than most people speak with words. And they had seen a marriage made not for show, but for endurance. It wasn't dramatic goodbye. It wasn't a public crisis. It was a quiet, unspoken heartbeat between two people who have carried each other through shadows and storms. And sometimes that's the story that matters most. Microphone audience message, warm, natural, engaging. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, or if you enjoyed deeper, more human looks behind a royal curtain, let me know in the comments. Your thoughts help shape the next stories we explore together. And if you haven't yet, feel free to like the video, subscribe for more royal insights, and share it with someone who loves emotional, cinematic storytelling. You make this community stronger, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.